Joining us now, Semaphore White House correspondent Shelby Talcott and Financial Times columnist and provost of King's College, Cambridge, Gillian Tett. Shelby, what's behind this?
Well, I think this all, of course, stems from the fact that interest rates aren't being lowered. We've heard the president talk about this for months. It is a clear thing that he wants. He wants those interest rates lowered. He's gone after Jerome Powell for months, publicly and privately. And this is sort of, I think, ratcheting up the pressure in a different way. And there's also people inside the administration, lawmakers that we've heard from who are in favor of trying to put more pressure in this way on Jerome Powell. But it is really splitting the Republican Party as well, because there are people who are, of course, saying that this would be a really bad move to try to sort of use this to ultimately fire him.
So is it pressure to get him to change rates? Is it trying to build a case to fire him for cause? Which one is it? Is it both?
I think it is potentially all of the above. I think ultimately the president wants those interest rates lowered. If he can do it by using this pressure campaign, great. But if Jerome Powell doesn't budge, I think certainly this is also, considering whether or not there is a way to remove him. Now, the president pushed back on what White House officials had told us last week, that there was a conversation inside the administration with lawmakers over whether or not to fire Jerome Powell. He said that some of the lawmakers wanted to, but he is more conservative in this manner. I think ultimately we're going to have to see, because certainly there's pressure on Trump to do so. He said so himself.
So what exactly is Scott Bessent talking about, Gillian? Could you have any idea when he says they want to review the entire Federal Reserve? Has the organization been successful? And then he compares it to the FAA and says, if we've seen so many mistakes, we would go back and look at it. What mistakes is he talking about with the Federal Reserve?
Well, I think Scott Bessent mentioned the FAA because he knows that's something that President Trump understands, like many of his voters. And essentially, I think what Secretary Bessent is trying to do is have it both ways. On the one hand, he's been quietly telling the power plays in the financial markets that he doesn't want to fire Powell. He knows that would be very destabilizing for markets. He used to be a macro hedge fund trader himself, and he knows exactly how the traders will react if Powell gets fired. But on the other hand, he has to please his boss. And so calling for a review like this is one way to please his boss and show he's actually doing something, and trying to keep up the pressure on Powell as well. And as we all know, what President Trump likes to do is have maximum leverage and control over people he doesn't necessarily like, and of course those he does like. So all of this is a game to build his leverage. At the end of the day, I actually don't think President Trump does want to fire Powell, because at the moment he's a very, very convenient piñata. If the economy slows down in the coming months, which is quite likely to do, then he has someone to blame other than himself. And so basically heaping pressure on Powell is a way of deflecting away from other issues in the economy, like the potential impact of tariffs.
Has the damage already been done, though? So say Powell does end up lowering rates and sometime in the near future. How does he escape the allegation that he was politically pressured to do so?
Well, of course, the damage has been done in terms of the undermining of the Fed's credibility. But one of the really critical things that everyone should think about right now is the difference between short-term rates, which the Fed actually controls by lowering or raising the policy rate. That's the one that gets all the attention during policy meetings. And then the long-term rate, the 10-year rate and beyond, which is actually set by the markets. That's determined by what the investors think the risk is for America going forward in terms of inflation and whether it can pay back its debt or not, and growth. And what is really important that everyone watching has to understand is that although the short-term rate, which the Fed controls, remains moderately reasonable, it's not crazy high, it's not crazy low either, the long-term rate that the market determines has been rising quite sharply since January. And what that shows is that investors are quite concerned about the long-term credibility of treasuries. And if Powell is fired by President Trump or by Scott Bessent, there is every chance that the long-term rate will rise quite sharply. And it's that rate which impacts people's mortgage costs or credit card borrowings in the longer term. So there's a limit to what President Trump can actually control just by ordering Powell to cut rates.
Yeah, I wonder how that might be affected if maybe Donald Trump doesn't end up firing Powell, but he lines up a successor that is more political. Who do we have right now, Shelby, leading the race to potentially be named the next Fed chair?
Well, notably, we started this, talking about Scott Bessent. He's one of the people who have been mentioned a lot about potentially doing this. And I do think that there are a lot of names, this time around in the Trump administration writ large, not just talking about the Fed chair. One of the things that this administration has been really careful about doing is appointing people in, for example, cabinet positions who are seen as loyalists, who are seen as people who will sort of follow the Trump agenda and do what he wants, because there was a lot of frustration with the first term in terms of, the president hired people who he felt like ultimately undermined his agenda. So it is safe to say that whoever the president picks next time will be someone like a Scott Bessent, perhaps a Scott Bessent himself, who has the trust of the president and is following the president's agenda.
Do the long-term rates react positively or negatively to Scott Bessent, Jillian?
It all depends on who comes in and what combination of factors are around any appointment, because one of the more radical ideas floating around is that Treasury Secretary Bessent could end up running both the Fed and the Treasury. That's an idea being advanced by some of the far-right influencers.
Wow.
I think that Bessent is smart enough to realize that's a really dumb idea.
Well, that would be
Bessent
deleting, deleting the separation between the politics and the independent agency.
Absolutely. End of independence at the Fed. I think that actually the markets will probably react quite positively to Scott Bessent, because he is seen as a grown-up in the room right now by many of the big financial players, because he understands finance, and that's a good start. And he's been, emitting plenty of reassuring language in private, whatever he says in public, the public stuff that Trump hears. Some of the other people are also, potentially. Kevin Walsh is another very credible candidate. And even Kevin Hassett would be probably welcomed by the markets right now.
Well, you just damned Scott Bessent with praise, calling him the grown-up in the room. Jillian Tett.
It's also compared to what else is in the room, of course.
Jillian Tett, thank you so much. Shelby Talcott, thank you as well.